Tens of followers. All right. How's everybody doing? All right. You pumped to talk about some eschatology? All right. Kurt, are we good? Good, we're good. All right. Well, people are still coming in. Make sure you got a handout. If you didn't get a handout, just go back out to the foyer and get a handout and sign in. If you didn't sign in, be a good thing. And let's go ahead and pray. Lord, thank you for our time together. I pray that we would honor you in the ways that we relate to one another, in the ways that we study your word. And Lord, we just pray that these would be tools that help us have further understanding about what is to come and how to relate to these different views. And we pray that in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so this week we're going to be looking at 4 different views on Revelation. Kind of Revelation and Daniel, or maybe even just 4 different views on eschatological texts, but really we're focusing on Revelation tonight. Now, we're going to get into some more stuff over the next few weeks. Like, for example, we're going to go look at some of the stuff like in Daniel, different views on that. I want to look a little bit, maybe even at some point walk through the book of Revelation from these different viewpoints and help you understand the logic behind them. But I also kind of want this to be driven a little bit by you. So I knew for sure that I wanted to share what I was going to share last week, and I knew for sure that I wanted to share what I was going to share this week. But after this, I've kind of got some ideas, but before I kind of formulate it, I kind of want to draw on what you guys feel is most helpful and needed in this discussion, so that your Q&A time, the Q&A time will be helpful for that. So remember to be taking some notes, asking some questions. You can kind of ask questions as you go, but maybe also keep them till the end. You kind of just, you feel out if it's a question that needs to be asked in the moment or one that needs to be asked at the end. But write those down. We're going to have a time of Q&A at the end. Again, just a quick review. Eschatology, what does it mean? Study of the end times or final things, yeah. Okay, and let's see. Yeah, it's good. Here's some relevant passages. How many of you read these passages this week? Some of you did. All right, great. All right, guys. You guys want to learn this stuff? Or? All right. This next week, how about you write those down and read them, so we can learn some stuff, all right? All right, so here's the deal. If anybody like needs the notes from tonight or the other nights, then you can email the church. We'll get them to you. Email Ocean or talk to Shelby or Ocean, get you notes. And we are recording this in video. We're doing it mostly not to publish it, because before we would publish something, we would want it to be maybe a little bit more polished and honed. This is my first time teaching through the content. And invariably, whenever we do a class like this, we do it multiple times and it gets better over time. So because it's our first time, we are recording it, but it's mostly for the sake of people who wanted to be here but couldn't be here. And so, but also some people maybe want to review and things like that. Let us know if you need the recording. We'll post it. I think we post it with an unlisted link, so you just got to ask for it. We'll get it to you. All right? So these are the passages that I think are most relevant to read, but I would encourage you to do that if you haven't yet done so. Okay, here's what I want to talk about this week, which is I want to talk about the book of Revelation, specifically kind of 4 views on it. But within that, there's going to be a lot of lists of things this week, okay? So you might want to, if you're a note taker, or if you're not usually a note taker, might be a good time to do that. So 3 genres of Revelation. We're going to talk mostly about the book of Revelation. Again, although our discussion will apply to other passages of the Bible that are eschatological in nature. So Revelation has 3 genres, okay? Apocalyptic, prophetic, and epistolary. Now, it's important to note this. The emphasis that different people give to those three genres will influence the way that they interpret the book. Let me explain. And it can kind of go vice versa, by the way. It can, which one is it the chicken or the egg? Which one's coming first? But let's put it this way. Some people view the book of Revelation as being primarily apocalyptic. We're going to talk about what that means in just a second. But other people view the book of Revelation as being primarily prophetic. Now, those who view it as being prophetic don't see it as being, particularly obscure, meaning like they think that it's a prophecy and therefore it's meant to be understood. Other people would say, well, it's apocalyptic, therefore it is by definition veiled, hard to understand, etc. Now, some people see it more as an apocalyptic literature. Other people see it more as prophecy. And the way you lean on that will influence the way that you view the book and what you expect from it, okay? So keep that in mind. We'll just keep going. Epistolary, this is like epistles, like we talk about with the letters. I'll explain that in a second. Let's talk about apocalyptic literature for a second. So apocalyptic literature is a genre which developed in post-exilic Judaism. Post-exilic Judaism means after they came back from the exile in Babylon and a little bit in Persia. Because you remember what happened is the northern tribes of Israel, they go off, they get exiled into Assyria. Then Assyria gets taken over by Babylon. And Babylon then conquers Judah, the southern kingdoms of Israel. And so then they take them over there. So essentially the people are reunited during the exile. But then even Babylon itself got taken over by Persia. And then they came back, right? And we read about that in the, post-exilic prophets, etc. But during that post-exilic period is when this genre of literature developed, which is called apocalyptic literature. Now, what it means is this. What it is, it's a means of communicating prophecies. Now, keep that in mind. Apocalyptic literature is a means of communicating prophecies, and specifically prophecies about the future day of the Lord. So those of you who were here last week, you'll remember that we saw that progression of Old Testament eschatology, how it had kind of what I called the continental divide of the Old Testament being around there at 2 Samuel chapter 9. After, one side, it's all building up, and then the other side, it's all coming down. Well, after that time, remember the people understood that what was going to happen wasn't just going to be that the reign of righteousness and truth would come in through the ascendancy of Israel. Rather, they realized that this is going to come in this future day of the Lord. And so they began looking forward to the day of the Lord. Well, after the exile, there's this writing, and God was communicating through visions. Oftentimes in an apocalyptic genre, you have a message which is given with very highly symbolic imagery, and it's often given by an angel. They'll say an angel spoke to me and gave me this vision, etc. And anyway, it's generally about the future day of the Lord, which again we talked about last week. So here's some examples of apocalyptic literature in the Bible and in outside of the Bible, right? So Daniel has some parts, not all of it. So that's important to recognize. Even in Revelation, not all of it's apocalyptic. Some of it is, some of it isn't. Same with Daniel. Some parts are apocalyptic. Zechariah, highly figurative and apocalyptic. Revelation, obviously, is apocalyptic. But here's what's also important. There are many non-canonical writings, meaning writings which are not in the Bible, nor should they be in the Bible, right? It's not like they were excluded for any reason that was nefarious. They shouldn't be in the Bible, but they're non-canonical. Largely, if you've heard of the Qumran community, these are the people amongst whom they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. When we go to Israel, we're going in November. I think we still got a slot or two open for anybody wanting to jump in there. But we go to Qumran. It's right on the Dead Sea, and it's where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there in that community, they found a lot of other writings other than the Bible. But many of these writings were kind of this apocalyptic genre, which were about the future day and the coming of the Lord. So Revelation fits in this. The word revelation comes from the Greek word apocalypse, where it's apocalypsis, which means unveiling. Now, I think that's actually important that we recognize that. Unveiling, it means making known things that were not previously known or which could not be known otherwise. Therefore, the purpose of revelation, we can surmise, and of course apocalyptic texts in general, is to reveal things which were not previously known, to make known things that were not known. And it means the purpose of it is not to make things more obscure than they already were. Okay, so I think that's an important point to make. If the purpose was to make things more obscure, it wouldn't be a revelation. It wouldn't be an unveiling of things that were previously veiled. Okay, let's continue. I think there are three common approaches to eschatological texts. Maybe some of you can relate to these. I think the first one is fixation. Another word you could use for that is obsession, right? I think fixation is maybe just a nicer way to say that. Indifference or hesitation. So those who find themselves in the third camp, the hesitation camp, they tend to feel that Revelation and the other eschatological texts in the Bible, they're confusing, they're unclear, and they tend to be divisive, meaning Christians get in fights and divide over them, and they get in arguments about these things. So people who respond with hesitancy, right, they'll say, it's better to just avoid these texts, or, maybe study them on your own, but they're, not really important. The people who would say they're indifferent, we're going to see that feeling of indifference comes from some particular interpretations of Revelation, which actually would tell you that you should be indifferent about Revelation. And then you get these other people, right, who are fixated on these things, right? They're hyper-focused on them, trying to figure out who's who and who the Antichrist is and why is it Barack Obama and things like that, right? Okay, so, so these texts are given to us not so we would avoid them, though. I want you to understand that. These texts were not given to us so that we would avoid them, nor be hesitant about them. Do you realize that the book of Revelation is the only book in the Bible which comes with a promise of blessing for those who read it and for those who hear it? Here it is, verse 3. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it, for the time is near. So this is the only book of the Bible that comes with a built-in promise for those who read it and those who hear it. You will be blessed. So the purpose of Revelation, as the title tells us, is not to confuse us, not to obscure things further regarding the end times, but to reveal and make known what will happen in the end. And rather than being hesitant about it, we should be eager to at least study these things because they have a purpose, and their purpose is to be encouraging, right? So, in addition to the common response of hesitation, of course, there are those who fixate on it. And what I would say fixation means maybe spending an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out who or what the different symbolic language in the Bible represents. People who are quick and willing to divide over particular interpretations of these texts, or who demonize those who hold other views, I would say that falls in that first category. And I would say this, Jesus made it clear that we are not to fixate on these things. So we shouldn't fixate, we shouldn't be indifferent, and we shouldn't be hesitant. That's my point. None of those three responses is acceptable according to what the Bible teaches. And here's why. Like Jesus said regarding fixation. We read in the book of Acts, chapter 1, verses 6 through 8, about how it says this: when they had come together in Jerusalem, right, after Jesus' resurrection, they asked Jesus, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? And he said to them, it is not for you to know the times or the seasons that the Father has fixed by his own authority, but you will receive power when my Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And then in Matthew 25, I mentioned this last week, but I'll mention it again. Jesus answers the question, what does it mean practically to be ready for Jesus' return and the end of the age? And Jesus answers that question with a parable about the talents, in which he says basically this: what it means to be ready and what you should be doing until the master returns at an unknown hour is you should be busy about the mission he's given you and investing the talents that he's given you into the things that he's called you to do. So spreading the knowledge of him, the love of God, the good news of the gospel to the world until he returns. That's what it means to be ready for the coming of Jesus. So rather than fixating, we should be busy about the work that God calls us to do, understanding that he wants us to live with a constant expectation of his imminent return. But although we're called not to be fixated on trying to figure these things out, meaning the details of the end of the age, it would also be a mistake to be indifferent about these things. One reason is because, again, we just saw Revelation comes with a promise of blessing for those who read it and those who study it. But another reason we shouldn't be indifferent about these things is because Jesus told us not to be indifferent about these things, right? He told us to keep an eye out for the signs of the times. Just as a sailor looks at the sky at night and knows what weather is about to happen in the morning, we too should not be ignorant. That's what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians. He says, I do not want you to be ignorant about these things. So we shouldn't be indifferent. We shouldn't be ignorant about these things. We need to understand where we stand in regard to the eschatological plan of God. And he gave us these things for a reason. It's important to remember that. He gave us these things for a reason. And the reasons are, according to the Bible, we see here in Revelation chapter 1, so that we would be blessed. Okay, another reason in 1 Thessalonians 4 is so that we would be encouraged. He says, encourage one another with these words. And you know what else? It's so that we would live with urgency, understanding our place in history and what awaits the world, that there's a lot at stake, right? So knowing these three, with these three common views, the fixation, indifference, and hesitation, we can say none of these are acceptable according to Scripture. Rather than doing these things, we should look into these things. We should study them. We should not be ignorant about them. We should keep our eyes on the signs of the times, and we should be encouraged by it. Okay, so back to three genres of revelation. So while we remember that the revelation or apocalypse, which means unveiling, we also remember that what makes our understanding of these texts difficult is the apocalyptic nature of the text, right? In apocalyptic literature, we're given symbols and images, but we're not told what those symbols represent. Sometimes we are, but not every time. And not most times, actually. Furthermore, what makes Revelation particularly complex is that it is not only a book of apocalyptic imagery. It is also a book of prophecy. Do you remember what it says in Revelation 1, verse 3? I'll go back and show you. Look what it says. Blessed is one who reads aloud the what? Words of this prophecy. So this isn't just an apocalyptic book, it's also prophetic. Now that's important as we will consider how to understand Revelation. We want to remember that this is also a prophecy. Now, furthermore, the entire book is written in the form of a letter. That's where the epistolary point comes in there. It's a letter from John to his readers. Now, what that means is that there are some things in Revelation, as there are in other eschatological texts, that are meant to be taken literally. They are not veiled, not symbolic. They are meant to be taken literally. And there are other parts which are intended to be taken symbolically or figuratively, right? So the question of which parts should be taken literally and which parts should be taken figuratively, that is the question, right? That is the big question that is at the heart of why there are different interpretations of Revelation. Now, we're going to talk about that as we go on. Now, I gave you a handout. I want you to just take a look at it. It's a color one. I didn't make that, by the way. I found it, but I thought it was pretty good. I think it meshes well with what I was going to give you, which is just a list. I figured you guys would like looking at a chart better than a list. But here's the structure of Revelation. So you got your bookends, right? Your introduction and your epilogue. In between there, you have 4 visions. I'll get to those visions in just a second. You also have 4 series of 7 things. And in between those series of 7 things, you have interludes. Interludes is where they kind of break in and give you a little bit more information about some different things that are happening or will happen. Okay, the structure. So let's look at those 4 visions. So just going back, here's your structure again. Introduction, 4 visions, 4 series of 7s, 4, and then interludes. Okay, so that's not necessarily in order, right? This isn't, those are mixed up, and I'll give you the verses for those. Okay, so the 4 visions come in here, right? We've got one in 1 verse 19, an important vision right there, and we'll talk about why. Then chapter 4, verse 1, chapter 17, verse 1, and chapter 29, verse 9. So it consists of these 4 visions which involve John seeing the plan of God being unveiled, okay? Then we can talk about the 4 sevens, a series of 7 things. First, we see 7 letters in chapters 2 and 3, followed by 7 seals in chapters 5 through 8, 7 trumpets, chapters 8 through 11, and 7 bowls in 15 and 16. Now, how these relate to each other is really interesting. Basically, what it's often referred to as the main view on this is that these dovetail with each other, meaning this: the 7th seal, the 7th trumpet, and the 7th bowl are all the same thing. Right? So they build up, but they won't give you the 7th. They build up, they won't give you the 7th. They build up, and then the 7th, if you look at the 7th seal, trumpet, and bowl, they're all the same thing. And that thing is the parousia, the eschaton, right? That final event that is going to take place, the day of the Lord, as the Old Testament calls it. So another important thing about this is that the seals, trumpets, and bowls, they become increasingly severe, right? So the bowls are more severe than the seals. I'm sorry, the trumpets are more severe than the seals. The bowls are more severe than the trumpets. It builds up and it dovetails on the 7th one, which all coincide with the final event. The interludes are found here, okay? The interludes interrupt the 4 series of 7s to give us a little bit more information. Now, again, we're not going into the details of what those are at this stage. We can in future classes if you'd like, but this is just the basic structure, interludes. And some more of that will be on that diagram I give you as well. Okay, let's talk about 4 major interpretations of Revelation and Daniel. Preterist, historicist, or historist, should say historicist, sorry. I think I wrote it wrong. Preterist, historist, futurist, and idealist. So the preterist means past. So the preterist interpretation basically means this. It understands the events of Revelation in large part as having been fulfilled in the first centuries of the Christian era. Most specifically, they say, at the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and some preterists would say, and also at the fall of Rome in the 5th century, 400s AD. But the majority view is just really the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The historicists, on the other hand, they view the events of Revelation as unfolding over the course of history. This perspective was mostly held by the Protestant reformers who believed that the Pope of their day was the Antichrist. So if you read, especially Martin Luther, and some of the others, they really believed that the Catholic Church was that, one world religion that had been corrupted and that the Pope was the Antichrist and that it was being fulfilled in their time. So that's called the historicist view. Again, mostly held by the Protestant reformers, but it also fell out of popularity around the year 1700. It's basically held by nobody nowadays, just so you know. I'll explain that more in a second. But futurists believe that the events of Revelation are still, for the most part, yet to be fulfilled. Particularly, historicists would say Revelation chapters 4 through 22 have not yet been fulfilled. And I'll explain why that is as we get into looking at those futurist positions tonight. But yeah, they say that most of Revelation, chapters 4 through 22, for the most part, have not yet been fulfilled, and it awaits fulfillment in a time yet to come. And this would apply to Daniel as well, right? Whereas a preterist would say, no, that has already happened and been fulfilled, particularly talking about the different empires that Daniel talks about. And then the futurist would say, no, there's still part of that which has not yet been fulfilled. And then you've got the idealist viewpoint. Okay, so idealist viewpoint says that the symbolism of Revelation is not actually pointing to any concrete historical events, neither in the past nor in the future. Rather, they would argue that Revelation exists to illustrate, in dramatic description, the timeless truths about the battle between good and evil that will always go on until Jesus returns. So those are the 4 views there. Now, I'm going to narrow it down to 3 views because, as I mentioned, the historicist view is no longer held by almost anyone, including the groups who traditionally held it, which was what are called the magisterial reformers, right? And so these would be like Lutherans, Calvinists, Presbyterians, kind of later on. But yeah, they originally held this view, believing that the medieval popes were the fulfillment of the things about the Antichrist. But the reason this view kind of fell out of popularity basically across the board is because the medieval popes simply did not end up fulfilling all the prophecies of Revelation about the Antichrist. And so they just fell out of view and different explanations had to be found. So let's talk about this. This is important. I was actually planning on talking about this in a different class, but I realized as I was preparing this that you can't really talk about these other views without understanding their take on this one thing, which is called the millennium. Now, I'd encourage you, it's 10 verses, so I'm not going to read them aloud right now, but I would encourage you, look at Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 10. They talk about this time, which is called the millennium, which at the end of this time of great trouble, tribulation, when God's judgment is being poured out on the world, we see that Jesus returns. There's this 1,000-year period of peace, justice, righteousness on the earth in which Jesus is ruling. And then Satan is bound during this time. And at the end of it, Satan is released. There's one last great push against Jerusalem. And then that culminates with the Jesus' return in judgment against Satan, casting him into the lake of fire, and the great white throne judgment, right, which we call Judgment Day. So the millennium is interesting. Again, in addition to the 3 major views on eschatological texts, we have this other factor, which is pretty important. It both influences and is influenced by the interpretive lens through which people read these eschatological texts. So that is the millennium. Now, this passage in Revelation, these 10 verses, this is the only passage in the Bible which directly talks about this 1,000-year reign of Christ on the earth prior to the great judgment. Now, the fact that this is the only verse in the Bible that talks about this, some people have taken that and they've said, well, because this is the only verse that talks about this in the Bible, surely it should not be taken literally. The argument against that is to say, okay, but here's a verse in the Bible, right? Like you don't have to have like a bunch of them just to believe something, right? Like if it's in the Bible, shouldn't we like at least consider it and believe it, right? So those are the 2 basic arguments that go on about this. But again, some people take this as they say this is the only place where this is explicitly talked about, and since that's true, we should not take it literally. Because if it was to be taken literally, we'd probably have other places in the Bible that talk about it. Again, those on the other side would argue there are other places in the Bible that talk about this, but they don't talk about it as explicitly. They just describe it. So this is something we talked about in our Q&A last week when we talked about passages like in Isaiah chapter 11 or Isaiah chapter 36, which describe this idyllic period that will exist on the earth. And yet during that period, there will still be sin and death, etc. And so these people would say, well, this passage is written very straightforwardly, right? Like this is what's going to happen. But those other passages describe it, and they only make sense if this is true. Okay, so again, those other passages may not say it directly, but they're describing it. That's basically the argument. So some passages like that, Isaiah 11, Isaiah 36, and there are others. So 3 views on the millennium. You have premillennial, postmillennial, and amillennial. Premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial. Now we'll explain these. Premillennialism states that there's a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth where he will be physically present. And this will happen prior to the final judgment and what's called the final resurrection. Generally, like premillennialism believes that the world, meaning culturally and morally, will get worse and worse, culminating in a time of great tribulation prior to Jesus' return. Okay, within premillennialism, you have 2 main views, and these are called historic premillennialism and dispensationalism. So we'll talk about this real quick here. Historic premillennialism is the view that was held by actually the early church fathers. The earliest of church fathers held this view. So we have writings from men like Irenaeus, church father, Justin Martyr, early church apologist. We have a man named Papias of Hierapolis. He was a Christian leader, a bishop in the early church, bishop of Hierapolis. And he writes about this explicitly, saying this is what Christians believe about what will happen. They said that Jesus will return and he will reign on the earth prior to the great judgment and prior to the age to come, meaning like what we would call heaven. Now, sometimes 1 Corinthians 23 through 28 is used as like being a, I don't want to say proof text, but they read it and they say, this is what that is, right? This is that millennial view. So 1 Corinthians 15, 23 through 28. So dispensationalism, on the other hand, and we'll talk about a few more distinctions in a minute between historic premillennialism and dispensationalism, but this is just in regard to this view of the millennialism, the millennium. Dispensationalism teaches that, and this is based mostly like off of like Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, and passage in the Bible, like where Jesus talks about the time of the Gentiles, etc. So they would say that there are different dispensations of time. Now, generally, it's broken down into 7 dispensations, but it varies. You know, there are some different views on dispensationalism, which some would break it down into as few as 3. Others would break it into 8, but it's generally in there. Most people would say 7. I'll give you a list of them here in just a second. But basically they say these are different periods of time in which God has revealed himself and related to people differently throughout time. Now, a simple reading of Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2 would seem to say this, right? Like God, who at different times has spoken in different ways, right? Through the fathers, the prophets, and in these last days through his Son. And so this is the idea that God has revealed himself to people in different ways at different times. Sometimes this is referred to as progressive revelation, but here are the 7 dispensations. So we have the dispensation of innocence. This is basically prior to the fall of man. This is like Adam in the Garden of Eden. This ends with sin coming into the world in Genesis chapter 3. That dispensation is sometimes called the Adamic dispensation or Adamic covenant or Adamic law. The second one is called conscience, and so that is generally seen as the way that God was relating to people from the fall up until the time of the flood. Then after the flood, there's this period which is referred to as the period of human government. And that ends with the time of the Tower of Babel. So you can see up to Genesis 11, we've already gone through 3 of the 7 periods. But then there's a time of promise. This begins in Genesis 12 with Abraham, and it goes up until the time of Moses. So remember, this is prior to the law. That's followed by the time of the law, which is Moses until Jesus. And some people would say up until even the time of the scattering of Israel in 70 AD at the sacking of Israel. And then finally, what we would live in now is generally referred to as the age of grace or the age of the church. And that will go from the cross until the return of Jesus at the end of the time of great tribulation. And that will give way to the next one, which is known as the kingdom age or the millennial age. So, going back to dispensationalism. So dispensationalism teaches that the millennium is a time in which, and this is kind of a key factor, the Old Testament promises of Israel will be fulfilled in a literal way. So when we read all these Old Testament promises about Israel, dispensationalists say that during this time of the millennium, the Old Testament promises to Israel, which have not yet been fulfilled, will be fulfilled during that time, especially the passages about the Messiah's rule on earth that are talked about in the prophetic books, and the promises, for example, about Israel being regathered and living in a kingdom of peace and justice in which the whole world will be ruled by the Davidic king ruling from his throne in Jerusalem. So supporting the idea of a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ prior to the great judgment is an important thing that I think to take note of, is this, that actually perhaps one of the reasons why early Christians believed in premillennialism, right? And they believed in a literal reign of Christ, like the earliest church fathers, Irenaeus and these guys, is because there are some extra biblical Jewish writings. Remember, not everything that Jewish people wrote was put in the Bible, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't reflect what they actually believed. It does reflect what they actually believed, but it doesn't necessarily mean it needed to be in the Bible. Now, there are some extra biblical Jewish writings which talk about this Jewish expectation of what we could call a preliminary kingdom on earth of the Messiah prior to the age to come. Now, the reason I bring that up is because sometimes one of the criticisms that's brought up against the premillennial viewpoint is that it's a relatively new viewpoint when you look at church history. My point is to say dispensationalism, that's probably true. Dispensationalism is a pretty new schema, if you will, for looking at the Bible and looking at the end times things. But premillennialism is actually, perhaps we could say, the oldest of the Christian viewpoints. And we see it actually portrayed in some Jewish writings as well. Okay, let's talk about postmillennialism for a minute. Postmillennialism, you can see on the screen. So they believe in a non-literal 1,000-year reign of Christ. So they would say 1,000 just means a super long time. It doesn't mean 1,000 years. It could mean 2,000 years. It could mean 1,000,000 years, right? It just means a lot. And so they say it's not literal, and it's not a physical reign of Christ on the earth. Rather, they say, it is the reign of Christ through the church culminating in his return. So they're very optimistic about the world and its history. Postmillennialists believe that the world will get increasingly better and better, and that the world will be successfully, for the most part, evangelized by the church, and not just evangelized, but Christianized prior to Jesus' coming and his return. So they're very positive about the world, right? So postmillennialism believes that the millennium is part of the church age, right? We talked about, so everybody kind of believes in dispensationalism to a degree, even if they don't use the term, right? They believe that we're in an age. And the age that we're in right now is the church age. Now, in this age, they would say that part of that age, this church age has been going on since Jesus' ascension on Pentecost. Church age began on Pentecost. And they say part of that time included a time of great persecution, specifically under the Roman rulers. And then we came through that, and they would say this whole thing about Satan being bound and us living in this reign of Christ on the earth, we're in it right now, guys. Can you feel it? We're in it. All right, so we're in it. Satan is bound, and that is why, and this isn't a terrible view, I'll just explain. Here's what they say. The reason why people are able to receive the gospel is because Satan is bound. He's been bound both by God, but he also must be bound in a way by the church who needs to basically Christianize the world, meaning we need to legislate righteous decrees on the earth in order to make the world this place that the Bible describes as this place of justice, righteousness, truth, etc. And so we will use the church will arise to ascendancy, and we will use our political power, our influence to usher in a time of righteousness and justice in the world. That will be the millennial reign of Christ. Now, this is a favorite view of those who, for example, believe that our job as Christians is to Christianize the world and usher in God's kingdom. Some would say that must happen before Jesus can or will return. Now, you can imagine when this view might have become popular. It became popular at a time in Christian history where the church, in some places, had indeed risen to a level of ascendancy and power. When the world was developing, right, and it seemed that everything was on the up and up. Everything was going up and to the right. And one day, things are just going to keep getting better and better. The world is going to keep getting evangelized more and more. And eventually, the world will become a Christian place. And the church will dominate politics, and everything will legislate Christian things. And that will usher in this millennial reign of peace and justice and righteousness by Jesus through the church on the earth. I found very interesting. The official date, by the way, of the postmillennial doctrine, it was actually formulated around the year 1700 by a Unitarian minister in England named Daniel Whitby. I just point that out to say this. Sometimes those who hold the postmillennial view will say, what's wrong with premillennialism or dispensationalism is that it's a relatively new view on the scene in church history. I just want to point this out. Postmillennialism only came about in the 1700s, right? And so also a relatively new view. Now, many postmillennial people claim that we currently live in the millennial reign of Christ right now, that Satan's currently bound. In my opinion, that's one of the biggest difficulties with accepting this position. History, especially 20th century and 21st century history, do not lend themselves to the belief that Satan is bound and the world is on the up and up. So let's talk about amillennialism. Now, this view was held by some of the church fathers, in fact, like Augustine, Origen, etc., but not the earliest ones, but either way, still quite early. And this view was held actually from the time of, let's say, Origen and Augustine. Again, they're not at the same time, but around that, so around 300 AD until the Reformation. This was the majority view of the church, the Catholic Church. So spiritual reign of Christ, not physical. And here's the big thing. They do believe that the world will get worse and worse. They believe that the millennial reign is not a literal millennium, but it is essentially Christ reigning in heaven. So the millennium's going on right now in heaven, but not here on earth, essentially is what they're saying. And they would say it takes place, this millennial time period is essentially the entire time from Jesus' ascension to Jesus' second coming. So we're living in it right now, but it's not here on earth, it's in heaven, and that is the amillennial take. Now, we'll get a little bit more into this as we go. Now, here's how these three views on the millennium relate to three views on the eschatological text. Premillennial people tend to be futurists. Futurist people tend to be premillennial. It goes back and forth. Postmillennial people tend to be preterists. And amillennial people tend to be idealists. Now, there are some partial preterists, we'll talk about what that means in a minute, who would say that they hold an amillennial view. And there are some futurists who would say that they hold a postmillennial view, right? So this is not everybody. There are a few exceptions to these rules. But generally, these are the way it usually pans out. Okay, let's talk about preterism. There are two views on preterism. You got your full preterism and your partial preterism. Now, partial expects that most of the prophecies in Revelation were fulfilled in 70 AD, maybe some in like 400 or so AD when Rome was sacked. But they would say that so they would say only a few are yet to be fulfilled. And almost always they would limit it to the return, the physical, literal return of Christ to the earth. The full preterist view actually goes beyond that. And they would say that the prophecies about the parousia, if you remember that word from last week, the second coming of Jesus, they would say those prophecies in, for example, Revelation and in the Olivet Discourse, those are the two most important in this view, that those were actually fulfilled. Meaning this, they say when Jesus said that he was going to return and every eye would see him, they say that actually did happen already, but not literally, not physically, not visibly. It happened figuratively and metaphorically in the coming of the Roman legion during the sacking of Jerusalem. They would say that was essentially God coming, Jesus coming to Jerusalem in the Roman legion to bring judgment upon Jerusalem for having rejected Jesus as their Messiah. Now, some people would say, and here's why they do that, because there's an Old Testament passage where the Lord says, "Behold, I am coming on the clouds," and he speaks about how he is coming in judgment upon Israel, and the way he came in judgment was through a foreign army. That's how that was fulfilled. So now they look at Jesus saying, "Behold, I'm coming on the clouds," and they say, oh, well, this, because Jesus said that must happen within this one generation, therefore it must have happened not physically and literally, but figuratively and metaphorically in the Roman legion. Now, I will say this. Some people would consider that full preterism is heterodox, meaning it is not orthodox. It is heresy. Yeah, that's the straightforward way to say that. Yeah. So they would say it's heretical. Since it does not believe in a literal physical return of Jesus, which we saw last week, is what is expressed in the earliest creeds of the Christian church, the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. So, talking about preterism, it holds that the bulk of John's prophecies occurred and were fulfilled in the first century, soon after his writing of them. Now, the preterist viewpoint wants to take seriously the historical interpretation of Revelation by relating to its original author and its original audience. John, it says, addressed this book to Christians who were about to face a dire situation and a problem in the first century AD. Now, here's the problem with it. Essentially, what this book says is that this was a prophecy and that it was given to the church because they were about to face something. The problem is, then, does this book have any relevance for us today? And the full preterist would say it does not, except to show us that, hey, God gave this cool prophecy to these people and it really helped them out. Cool, right? Like, essentially, that's the message of it. And that would lead us to what we said. We should not be obsessed with these texts. We shouldn't be, nor should we be indifferent about them. I would say that's kind of the problem here, is that it leads to an indifference about and it doesn't lead to an expectancy of his coming. To me, those are things to be worried about. But again, here's a big deal about preterism, is that we have writings from the church fathers, the early Christians, who all believed that Revelation, they said the dating of Revelation took place during the reign of Domitian, the Roman emperor, who persecuted Christians, and he exiled John to the island of Patmos. And that took place around 90 AD, after all the other people had died. But you know what else that's after? That's after the sacking of Jerusalem. So that means that when John describes, for example, Jerusalem having a temple in it, he knows that the temple has already been torn down in 70 AD. He's talking about something in the future. So this is the big debate. When was Revelation written? And again, the historical dating of Revelation had been to say it had to have been written. It was written, this is what people said, it was written around 90 AD, after the sacking of Jerusalem. The problem with the preterist interpretation is that if you remember, chapter 1, verse 3 of Revelation says, the words of this prophecy. So in order for it to actually be a prophecy, and not just a rehashing of some things that already took place and a spiritualizing of some things that already took place, it had to have actually taken, the book had to have been written before 70 AD, and not just before 70 AD, it had to be written before certain events in the life of Caesar Nero. So it had to have been written 64 AD. 64 AD, which is quite a bit earlier than the traditional dating of Revelation. And some people would say, well, that's a bit, you're kind of trying to, essentially, you painted yourself into a corner, and now you're coming back and saying, okay, well, then Revelation was written earlier, right? So that's kind of one of the criticisms against it. So if John wrote this book when Christian historians traditionally believed it was written 90 AD, then that would be a problem for the preterist viewpoint. Two basic arguments are put forth to defend this early dating of Revelation. One of those is that there definitely seem to be some allusions to Caesar Nero. For example, the beast who, has this wounded head. A lot of people say this is referring to a time when Caesar Nero almost died and then didn't die, right? Other people would say that 666, I mean, if you break it down with, was it called Grammatica or whatever it's called, where you're looking at the numbering of letters, it actually spells out Caesar Nero in that system. And so is 666 simply seems to be a reference to Caesar Nero. So, going on, so there seem to be many references to Caesar Nero in the book. That's the point. That's why some people say it must be an earlier writing. The other reason is because in Revelation 11, the temple is still standing in Jerusalem. And again, this is a good question. Was it written, therefore, before the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem? And that's why John had no idea that the temple was going to be destroyed. Or was it written after John already knew that the temple was going to be destroyed, but he looked forward to a time when the temple will have been rebuilt? That's kind of the big question. Now, premillennialists would argue that the reason the temple is still standing in Revelation 11 is because John anticipated a future time when the temple would be rebuilt. And one of the reasons why premillennialism grew in popularity during the 20th century was because of this unprecedented thing in history where after almost 2,000 years of being dispersed and scattered throughout all the world, this Zionist movement brought back the people of Israel to the land of Israel, and then they actually even got back the city of Jerusalem. Now, even to this day, they do not control the Temple Mount, and so premillennialists would say, well, when Jesus said Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until that time, they would say, well, that's still going on right now. Right? And so they look forward to a time when Israel as a nation will control the Temple Mount once again, will erect a new temple in the place of the old one. And one of the interesting things, again, if you go to Israel, you go to this place called the Temple Institute, which is Jewish people who have rebuilt all of the instruments to be used in the temple, and they are anticipating it and wanting to rebuild the temple. So again, the point is that it's plausible. A lot of the popularity of some of these other views said, well, it's not plausible that Israel could really be Israel in Jerusalem with a temple. Therefore, it must be to be understood figuratively, not literally. And now the difference is that it does seem to be plausible. Okay, another really important point, and you see this on the screen. It's based on a literal interpretation of Matthew 24, verse 34, which says this. Jesus is giving the Olivet Discourse. He's talking about the signs of the times and the signs of his coming and the end of the age. And then he gives this parable about a fig tree. And he says at the end of the parable of the fig tree, he says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Furthermore, Revelation 1 verse 3, it says, the time is near. Right? So if you read that, and then at the end of Revelation, Jesus concludes by saying, behold, I come quickly. So the preterist, for example, looks at this and they say, well, 2,000 years is not coming quickly, right? And they would say, Jesus said these things must take place within this generation. Now, did that mean that all these things must take place? That's where you get into partial versus full preterism. But full preterists particularly, but also partial preterists to a degree, they believe that Matthew 24, verse 34, is the hermeneutical or interpretive key to understanding the book of Revelation. So basically this, in order for what Jesus said there in Matthew 24:34 to be true, then all the prophecies of the Olivet Discourse and the book of Revelation had to have taken place within that generation that was alive when he said that. And that would include, according to full preterists, the return of Jesus. They would say he returned metaphorically and figuratively in the Roman legion. And they would say the book of Revelation is really the story or the prophecy about how God was going to judge the city of Jerusalem and the nation of Israel because they rejected Jesus as their Messiah. So when Revelation talks about Babylon, the preterist says it's referring to Jerusalem. If you remember when Jesus was being crucified, the people of Jerusalem, they said, let his blood be upon us and our children, right? And so what Revelation is describing is God's judgment upon Israel for rejecting Jesus and killing him, and the transition from the age of God's work through the people of Israel to the age of God's work through the church. Now, sometimes this is called replacement theology, and that gets to the fourth point there, Israel no longer part of God's plan. Sometimes called replacement theology, that the church has replaced Israel in God's plans and is the heir of the promises which were given originally to Israel. Now, again, I would challenge that by saying, okay, Romans chapter 11, very important. It said, Paul asks, has God therefore rejected his people Israel? Some translations say, has he cast them away? Other people would say, is he finished with Israel? And Paul's response is, by no means. Again, so once again, this view became very popular during a time when people believed that the nation of Israel would never again be a nation state. And there's also a belief that the ethnic nation of Israel, basically, there's no way to know that the Jews who call themselves Jews and live in Israel are actually descendants of Abraham, because so much time has gone on and there's no records of it because they were all destroyed in Jerusalem in 70 AD. Again, a challenge to that would be to say, not all Jews lived in Jerusalem, right? Plenty of them lived outside of Jerusalem. What about the ones who lived in Asia Minor or in other places of the world? And Jews are pretty good about keeping track of who's a Jew and who's not, right? So are we saying that they were not able to keep track of who was actually a Jew? I think that's kind of a weak argument a little bit. But I do agree with the idea that is often espoused by preterists, and I think it should be espoused by everybody, right? Which is that God essentially allowed the temple to be destroyed and the Jewish lineage to be lost, the records, if you will, in order to make a clean break with Judaism so that people could no longer put any stock or trust in being descendants of Abraham or having the temple to practice their faith. So one critique of this, I already gave you that. Okay. I'll tell you what I think is the biggest problem with this preterist position. Number one, the prophecies, I'm going to give you two reasons. Okay, so number one, the prophecies fulfilled in 70 AD, you can find some ways that they could have been fulfilled. And I think there's some pretty good explanations there. Some things really fit. But they don't fully fit. They don't fully fit. And that creates a problem, especially if you call yourself a full preterist, right? That's kind of what you're saying. Now, there is an explanation for this, which we'll get to in a moment. But in my opinion, it's not preterism. Okay? And this is, I think, the big one. It's based on this hyper-literal reading of Matthew 24:34, which says these things must take place in this generation. So think about this. In order to literally interpret that verse and apply it, you have to make everything else figurative, right? In other words, when Jesus says that he's coming back, you can't take that literally because you've already committed to taking this other thing literally that said it must all happen within this generation. So therefore, you say, well, Jesus said he's going to come back. Well, then he must have. Well, how did he do it? Well, he came not literally, not visibly, not physically, etc. So I think that creates a problem, right, where you're not being consistent. You're saying this must be taken literally, and therefore everything else must be taken figuratively. And again, this gets back to the genres of Revelation. This is why it's so important. Revelation is not only apocalyptic. it is also epistolary, right? The things in the beginning and the thing at the end are just a letter of a guy telling you, he's coming quickly, right? Like he's coming. He is coming. All eyes will see him. Should that be taken literally or not? And then the idea of prophecy, right? So prophecy and the idea that it's an unveiling. Okay, so those are my 2 cents on that view. Idealist, we won't spend as much time on this just because it's really simple. The idealist viewpoint on Revelation has sometimes been called the spiritualist view. It interprets the book spiritually or symbolically, completely. So Revelation is seen from this perspective as representing the ongoing conflict of good and evil with no immediate historical connection to any social or political events. The purpose of Revelation, according to this view, would be to put steel in your spine, right? To encourage you towards heroic living because Jesus wins in the end. That's the point, they say. Now, every view believes that, but they would say, well, this is really all that the book exists to tell you. It gives you endurance in the times that you're facing right now. It tells us that evil is going to be overthrown in the end. It gives us a new and wonderful picture of Jesus reigning in heaven, and it reveals to us the fact that history is in the mind of God and the hand of Christ as the author of our destinies and all these things. So the idealist viewpoint, it distinguishes itself by this. It says that Revelation's prophecies do not relate to any historical events. So it denies that the prophecies of Revelation are predictive, except in the most general sense of the promise of the ultimate triumph of good and the return of Christ. We're almost done, by the way, so we can quit now. It's been an hour. And how about I wrap this up, and then we can decide if we want to keep going or keep it for next week. But I'll just go here and finish this up. So this view of Revelation was indeed held by some of the church fathers, including Clement of Rome, Origen, Augustine, and Jerome, right? So pretty good names on this. It was the dominant view of the church up until the Reformation. Those who argue against this view, here are the big arguments against it. Well, mostly it would be to say this: if just the point of the book is that Jesus is going to win in the end, then why go into all these details, right? Like, why are you telling me all these other things? Couldn't you have just saved some ink and said, hey guys, no matter how bad it gets, Jesus is going to win in the end, all right? All right, good talk, right? Like, why did we need to have all these images and things which seem so detailed? Like, what was the point of it all? And furthermore, how is it a prophecy if it's just telling us something we already know, which is that Jesus is going to win in the end? How is it an unveiling? How is it a revealing if it doesn't reveal anything to us? And this view would also, another challenge would be to say, what you're saying in this view is that the book of Revelation is not actually unveiling, rather it's just obscuring, right? It's making it obscure. All right, so those who argue for this view would say that the idealist view makes the book actually even more relevant, right? Because it can be read in every generation, and every generation can relate to it in different ways. And that's why we have all the depictive imagery, right? Is so that you and I would look at it and we would say, hey, that's kind of like what's happening in our day. Just like people in the time of the Nazis, for example, would have said, hey, that looks a lot like what's going on in our day, right? And throughout history in different places of the world, people would relate to it and say, hey, that kind of reminds me of what's happening right now. And it would give them encouragement to do that, right? And they would say, in every generation, there is kind of an antichrist, if you will, right? Like, and there have been throughout history, kind of this kind of cyclical recurring themes. But in the end, God is going to judge wickedness and overcome evil. The only real notable structural feature of idealist interpretive things is that they do not avow a literal chronological reading of Revelation chapter 20, meaning that is the millennial thing. In amillennial fashion, that chapter is viewed as a symbolic description of the church's potential reign with Christ in this age. So this view views Jesus is reigning in heaven, and potentially we could reign with him here on earth if we, try hard and play our cards right. All right, guys, let me just stop there for a second. I've been talking for an hour. It's probably a lot. I've probably got another half hour to go, and so I think that we should call it quits for tonight. So that's what we're going to do. Next week, and where I want to kind of land this, and then we'll get into a little bit more next week too. But I want to talk to you about this futurist view, and the futurist view breaks into a couple different viewpoints: historic premillennialism, and then dispensationalism, which breaks into two further views, which are classic dispensationalism. So if you ever heard of Schofield Reference Bible, Hal Lindsey, these are kind of your classic dispensationalists. But even that is not, even within classic dispensationalism, two views. And then you get into progressive dispensationalism, and that's something I'd like to share with you guys. But I'll wait till next week. Take a break. What kind of questions do you have? And then we'll pray and wrap up. That was a lot, huh? All right. I see some half-raised hands, ear scratch. We'll go over here, and then we'll go over to Paul. Are you trying to tell me that there could be multiple layers of fulfillment for a particular prophecy? That's one of the things we're going to talk about in some of my upcoming slides. I'll let you look at them real quick. Okay, so we're going to talk about, historical premillennialism. But here, I want you to notice this. So dispensationalism is committed to a literal interpretation where possible, okay? But if you get into classic dispensationalism, this is what differentiates it from progressive dispensationalism, which is this. It would state, classic dispensationalism would state, there's only one correct interpretation for any given prophecy. Progressive dispensationalism would say, that's number 3, there can be multiple layers of prophetic fulfillment. Now, I fully agree with that, and I'll give you a couple reasons why. One reason would absolutely be the prophetic books, especially the minor prophets. So, for example, I think, John, you asked me this. We did a class on the minor prophets one time. So there's this one place in one of the minor prophets, actually almost every one of the minor prophets, where at the end of the book it says, Israel will be regathered to the land. But then it's, and this will happen, and this will happen, and the whole world will be ruled from Israel. And you're like, well, so was that fulfilled or was it not fulfilled? And the answer is, it's been fulfilled already, but not yet, right? So, I mean, that's the commitment to the already but not yet hermeneutic. There it is, over there. Right? Inaugurated eschatology, which we talked about last week. And so the idea would be this. Has it been fulfilled? Yeah, in part. But there awaits a further fulfillment. Now, you can actually apply that to the book of Revelation as well. And say, maybe that 666 thing actually is a reference to Caesar Nero, but it's essentially saying someone who will be similar to Caesar Nero because he didn't fulfill it in fullness. So it acknowledges that there can be multiple layers of interpretation. Now, I'll give you one last thing on this. That belief that there can be multiple layers of interpretation can actually be found in the Bible as the Bible talks about itself. So, for example, in Matthew chapter 1, Jesus, goes into Egypt as a refugee with his parents hiding from Herod the Great. And then it says, he went into Egypt until the death of Herod so that it would be fulfilled what was written, out of Egypt I called my son. Only thing is, that verse is from the book of Hosea. And when it uses that verse in Hosea, it's not talking about the Messiah. It's talking about, in its context, it's talking about Israel being brought out of Egypt. So what we have here is a place where that verse was fulfilled indeed by Israel being brought out of Egypt. but it was not fulfilled in fullness until the full layer of fulfillment came about during the time of Jesus, right? And so that's really interesting. So that would be one very good reason to believe in a progressive dispensationalist schema. Go ahead.
Regarding Matthew 24 and reading it literally, you brought up the problems with that, but it seems like in Matthew 26, where Jesus is before the high priest, and he says, "You will see the Son of Man coming in power."
Yeah.
And that Josephus and a Roman historian, Tacitus, they seem to point to signs in the skies.
Yes.
And the temple's not working right. And so there are a bunch of signs around that. So that to me points to some sort of literal fulfillment.
Yeah. So I'm with you there. I actually think that problem, which I brought up actually, that and actually it's in my notes here about progressive dispensationalism. The progressive dispensationalist schema, because it's based on this already but not yet hermeneutic, would say exactly what she was talking about, that there can be multiple layers of fulfillment, just as there are with the Old Testament books, where it'd say, was it fulfilled in part at the coming of, those things Jesus talked about, were they fulfilled in part? And the answer would be yes, but not in fullness. And so it kind of ticks all the boxes, I think, and that's actually why it came about. It was kind of like, well, you know what? Some of these preterists do make some pretty good points on different issues. And you know what? The amillennialists make a pretty good point about Jesus reigning from heaven right now. And can those things actually be brought together so that we can actually come up with a truly biblical case? And progressive dispensationalism came about really in the 80s through some people who were kind of revisiting dispensationalism and saying, well, do we need to update it? It was originally called modified dispensationalism, but then it became called progressive, not because, progressive meaning like liberal or something, but progressive meaning that there's a progression of fulfillment until the final fulfillment of these prophecies. So it's actually, I think actually it could answer that question. So, yeah. Anybody? All right. We got one here.
Do any of the words of Jesus himself lead you to one view or the other?
Yes. So the question was, do any of the views of Jesus himself lead you to one view or the other? The answer is absolutely. They play a huge role, especially the words of Jesus in Matthew 24 and 25. That's key. And the words of Jesus in the book of Revelation. Behold, I come quickly, and the other things that Jesus says, shows to John in that Revelation. So, yeah, I would say that they do. Yeah. But particularly that Olivet Discourse, I'll have to think if there's any other places where Jesus talks about things that lead you to that futurist position. So, any other questions? Last call. We got one back here. So, yes, that's what I said early on in the talk today. If anybody wants the slides, talk to Ocean or Shelby. They'll get you a link to them. And if anybody wants a video of this, then we are recording it, but we're not posting it publicly. We're just posting it unlisted. Cool? All right, let's pray. Lord, thank you that you are coming soon. We look forward to that. Lord, we pray that it would encourage us in the days that we live in. Help us, Lord, that we would not be ignorant about these things, that they would have their effect in our lives, that they would be a blessing and encouragement, something that gives us courage in the days that we live in as we await your coming. And Lord, help us that we would be ready for your coming by being actively engaged in your work in the world even now. And we pray that in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, thanks, everybody.